Our text this morning is out of Exodus chapter 5. We'll do verses 1 through 9, and then we'll skip down to verses 19 through 23. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the desert." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." That same day Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and foremen in charge of the people. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw. But require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the men, so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." The Israelite foremen realized they were in trouble when they were told, "You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day." When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, "May the Lord look upon you and judge you. You have made us a stench to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hands to kill us." Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Whom shall Israel serve? This is a question that has come up already in the book of Exodus. It's a question Moses wrestles with when he encounters the Egyptian beating the Hebrew slave. He struggles with it as he encounters God in the burning bush, and he asks, remember, in response to his call, "Who am I?" And interestingly, these two questions are not unrelated or disconnected. Who am I, and whom shall I serve? This is a question the elders of Israel must answer as Moses and Aaron explain what God had spoken to them. And it is one that becomes quite significant here in chapter 5, and really will remain with the people for a very, very long time. Whom shall Israel serve? This will not be a simple question to answer ever, really, for the people, but especially in the state in which we find them in Exodus chapter 5. Pharaoh's evil toward the Hebrew slaves has hit an all-time low. And we get a good look at his oppressive tactics here. And what we notice, I think, is really just how much oppression really is driven by this pattern of manipulation. And I would like for us to take a closer look at Pharaoh's manipulation of the Hebrew people. First, he manipulates the people's energy. Right? The idea being, if you can deplete the energy of the oppressed, well then, one, you minimize the threat of any resistance. Two, you maximize their dependence on your goodwill. Secondly, he manipulates who's really at fault, and we see him beginning by placing the blame on Moses and Aaron, right? Making the liberators in this case appear to be the ones who are really at fault. Well, they're the problem, and they're increasing the oppression of the people. But then he turns and he actually places the blame on the people. And in this case, he attributes some kind of character flaw. He calls them lazy. Lazy. You know, it's your own fault. You're just too lazy. It's your fault you've gotten to this point. As long as he, Pharaoh, doesn't appear to be the one to blame, well, then the oppression can continue. And he can remain at the top. It's interesting, but he even manipulates the prophetic messenger formula. Notice how in verse 1, Moses and Aaron come proclaiming, "Thus says Yahweh," but then by verse 10, there's a new proclamation to the people. "Thus says Pharaoh." He manipulates them time and again, and he manipulates them to the point of creating division among the community, right? Tear them apart from each other and from their God. If he can turn the people on themselves, then who else will they have to rely on but him? And this is really his ultimate aim in all of this. Martin Luther King Jr. notes this text in his own conflict, and I wish I could preach it like him. But he says, the Pharaohs had a favorite and effective strategy to keep their slaves in bondage, keep them fighting among themselves. The divide and conquer technique has been a potent weapon in the arsenal of oppression. But when slaves unite, the Red Seas of history open and the Egypts of slavery crumble. You know, as the reader, we're left with a bit of a cliffhanger by the end of the chapter, which is really appropriate. It is, if we're at all to relate to this people who day in and day out are wondering to themselves, who will prevail? Will it be Yahweh, our God, or Pharaoh, this deified ruler of Egypt? As one commentator puts it, the people's worry about a sword from Yahweh in verse 3 is a sword from Pharaoh by the end of the chapter. And so they're torn. The people are torn. They're tossed in this turbulence, manipulated to the point of having to ask, who are we going to serve? Who will prevail? Whose side are we going to take? Now let me warn you at this point, if you don't like spoilers, cover your ears. Though this chapter ends in a bit of despair, it really sets the scene up perfectly for Exodus 6, verse 1, in which we learn very clearly that Yahweh will prevail. And it will, of course, not be a simple victory, right? Pharaoh will not just roll over like some dog. Now, the people are so entrenched in oppression that it will indeed be a struggle, even for God. And as we said earlier, it's a struggle that will remain with the people for quite some time, throughout all of history, in fact. It is a struggle. Whom shall Israel serve? Now we have a bit of a luxury today that the people of Israel did not have. We know where this story is ultimately headed. And not just this story of the Hebrew people's exodus from Egypt, but the overarching narrative of the exodus of all of creation, how God will come and act on behalf of all people and all creation, passing through the waters of chaos himself to deliver his oppressed people out of bondage and into the promise. That the Red Seas of history will open and the Egypts of slavery will crumble. We know this. We've heard this. And still, we're often faced with this question ourselves. Whom shall we serve? It's a question that we must wrestle with today as we encounter our own sufferings and witness the suffering of others. Now, there are a number of ways this message could be applied today. Perhaps in hearing it, you're inspired to rise up and lead a rebellion against the feds. And if so, best of luck to you. Leave me out of it. But let me just suggest one way for us to answer this question today. In looking back at our story, did you notice that the Hebrew people, though they're a significant part of the story, they're there, but did you notice that they never actually speak? They've cried out before, certainly, but it appears here that their cries have been silenced under the weight of Pharaoh's oppression. And I bring that up because perhaps as we ask ourselves, who are we going to serve, we could find an appropriate answer by also asking ourselves, who are the voiceless among us? Because a very significant part of the church's mission, I believe, is to give voice to the voiceless. That when the Jedediah Bakers served the underprivileged in East Austin, or the Abel Salazars served faithfully at a Popeyes in San Marcos, really able, at a Popeyes, or the Amber Tandys or the Andrea Hendricks serve the elderly in South Austin, or any number of you, week after week, when the church gives voice to the voiceless, then our answer to whom shall we serve rings loud and clear. We will serve the Lord. And it's important for us to also remember that the voiceless are not just out there in the world. Oftentimes the voiceless sit with us in the pews each week, suffering silently like the slaves of Exodus 5. And some have been hurt not only by a conflicting world out there, but also by manipulative words from within, which tend to sting just a little bit worse, don't they? Now, I'm not going to ride that train for very long, but it does happen. And it's important as ministers that we know this. For them, we must ask, who are the voiceless among us each week? And how do we speak up on their behalf? Or at least, how do we join them in their silent struggle, which can speak 1,000 words ever so loudly? It is a daunting task. It's not easy. It's a question that Moses, Israel, indeed all of creation has asked itself since the beginning. Whom shall we serve? It is a very serious question that undoubtedly Jesus himself faced on many occasions, certainly in Gethsemane. But it is through the cross that we witness his response. And so as we live day to day amidst great suffering, facing our own cross, may we know the hope that has come through the cross of Christ. May we know the message of Exodus 6:1, Yahweh will prevail. And may we know that it has indeed been fulfilled today in the cross. And in these things, as we ask ourselves, whom shall we serve? May our response together be, we will serve the Lord. May God bless you as you go forth to serve him this week.